All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which also improves your listening experience. Before we get started, I want to tell all of you thank you for your tremendous support. People are slowly but surely finding out about who we are and what we do. They enjoy and respect the passion with which we speak. But as you always say here at Chin Check Sports Radio, we do this because we love it, as I'm simply sharing our passion with you all as we continue to build our listening army to take over the world. This broadcast is definitely coming on a somber note, but we also want to celebrate the life of the late former heavyweight champion of the world, Big George Foreman, who passed away this evening as reported by his family. And to the Foreman family, from Chin Check Sports Radio, you guys have our deepest condolences, our deepest sympathies on your loss, and really hope that time can begin to heal your wounds. And George Foreman definitely was an integral part of our love of boxing. We caught the end of his comeback, or the tail end of his comeback bid, that we have discussed on this program previously. Some of the great fights that we actually have discussed and broken down. He was the color commentator or the play-by-play guy for those fights. So we definitely wanted to talk about the career of George Foreman and pay our respects to a great champion. George Foreman won a gold medal in the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. Now, folks, if you know your history, 1968, that was during the civil rights struggle. So, you have the whole Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith with the black fist on the stand. That is still an iconic photo, and we actually have that hanging up at our residence. But George Foreman, coming from the poorest section, or one of the poorest sections of Houston, Texas, being part of the Job Corps and discovering boxing, definitely won a gold medal. So what really put George Foreman on the map in terms of his professional career was fighting Joe Frazier to win the heavyweight championship of the world. And that was January 22nd, 1973. Now, this is the Joe Frazier who was a heavyweight champion of the world, already had beaten Muhammad Ali in 1971 in that classic matchup. And George Foreman was 24 years old, really seen as a young stiff. There was talk of an Ali rematch. Again, now this is based on the documentaries and movies, so all the different sources, of course, we were not born at that time, so we're just going by, again, those documentaries, and whether it's on Don King, whether it's George Foreman, whether it's Muhammad Ali, whether it's Joe Frazier. So that was a consensus to get Ali a rematch. Again, this is Muhammad Ali coming off his conviction being overturned for refusing to be inducted into the Vietnam War. So this fight was really seen as a step up because, again, George Foreman, young, crude opponent. This is Joe Frazier. And what's always funny going into that fight, when you hear George Foreman talk about that fight, if you look at the face-off, Foreman face of stone. I mean, just no fear. But Foreman always stated that what people didn't know, he was actually scared on the inside. Because, again, this is Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier was the man. And Joe Frazier, rest in power to him as well. So George Foreman always stated that I was actually nervous, like just looking at Joe Frazier. And George Foreman in the first round knocks down Joe Frazier, and you hear the famous call by the late Howard Cosell, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier. And folks, that was one of the most brutal heavyweight championship knockouts of all time. Because George Foreman kept battering Joe Frazier, knocking him down. And the famous shot where George landed a hybrid right hook / uppercut was literally lifted Joe Frazier off the canvas. Now, again, go back and listen to George Foreman talk about the Frazier fight. He admits the reason why I kept knocking Joe Frazier down because I was afraid that he was going to get up and knock me out. So at 24 years old, Joe Frazier in Kingston, Jamaica, became the heavyweight champion of the world. On September 1st of 1973, a KO in the first round against Jose Roman to retain the title in Tokyo, Japan. March of 1974, a TKO in the second round against the late former heavyweight champion of the world, Ken Norton. The Ken Norton who already had a victory over Muhammad Ali, the late great Muhammad Ali, in Caracas, Venezuela. Now, if you go back and pit those two guys together, if you look at them physically, I mean, George with the big, large frame, Ken Norton with one of the best physiques ever in boxing history, and George Foreman knocked him out inside of 2 rounds, which set up the Rumble in the Jungle fight. Now, there's a great documentary called When We Were Kings, and I believe it was directed by Spike Lee, that actually talks about that particular fight. You have the specter of President Mobutu Sese Seko, who put up $10 million for that fight. That fight put Don King on the map as a world's greatest promoter, where, keep in mind, just 4 years prior, he was sitting in prison. So there's a lot about this fight, and what people forget is that George Foreman was a heavy favorite going into that fight. He was 25 years old. Muhammad Ali was in his 30s. Kind of seen as maybe, a little bit past his prime. He lost the first Joe Frazier fight, won his second fight, kind of, in an unspectacular fashion, but he won the fight. So Foreman was a heavy favorite. Again, young, 25 years old, hard puncher. Everybody thought Foreman was going to be the guy for a while. And quite frankly, one of the greatest upsets in boxing history, which tends to get overlooked because of what Ali became. But in terms of just boxing upsets, I'm talking about along the same lines of when when Cassius Clay beat Sonny Liston. This fight was right up there. And if you go back and watch Muhammad Ali's Sports Century, the ESPN documentary series that was in the late 90s going to the new century, that there was a part where there was a natural rivalry between Foreman and Ali. And I believe Ali's business partner, Gene Kilroy, stated that one day Foreman came inside the room and he was eyeballing Ali because, again, even Foreman knew that he was intimidating. He didn't take any mess. He had that stone face with the afro, and he starts staring at Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, of course, brash and says, "Boy, don't you eyeball me." And I was beating on saying, "Listen, when you were just a little boy, and I'll whip your butt right here." And Gene Kilroy stated that George Foreman walked away and at least felt that he gained a psychological edge going into that fight. So the fight was originally set up for September of 1974, but Foreman suffered a cut on his eye in training, so the fight was pushed back. And again, Muhammad Ali a KO in the 8th round. And the famous thing that we know about it is the rope-a-dope, where Ali just laid against the ropes and just let Foreman throw punches. Now, historians are kind of split. Historians feel that it was a great strategy by Muhammad Ali or a huge gamble and risk by Muhammad Ali to stand in front of a puncher like a Foreman. And again, go back to that When We Were Kings documentary where you see George Foreman hitting the heavy bag and you see the size of the hole that was in the heavy bag. So definitely you wouldn't want an older fighter like a Muhammad Ali standing in front of a tough fighter like a George Foreman. Now, let's put this into modern boxing times. You take any hard puncher. Would you really want your fighter standing against the ropes, like with his hands against his body? Absolutely not. So, but even Muhammad Ali's, his fight doctor, even Verdi Pacheco, he was saying that him and Angelo Dundee was telling Ali to get off the ropes, and Ali was telling him to shut up. I know what I'm doing. He's not hurting me. And Ali's strategy, as him and his people stated, was to empty George Foreman's tank. And George Foreman, his parachute would not open. Again, Foreman, think of it in a way of a Clubber Lang in Rocky 3. Pretty much you get him outside of 5 or 6 rounds. The stamina just wasn't there versus an Ali who had the stamina. And you clearly, when you watch that fight, you saw the punches weren't that effective. George is getting sloppier. And even George even states that at one time that even Muhammad Ali had even whispered in his ear, "Is that all you got, George?" And even George Foreman admitted, "Yeah, that's about all I got." And with a beautiful combination, knocks out George Foreman. So George Foreman suffers his first loss in the Rumble in the Jungle. His next fight afterwards is a KO victory in the 5th round against Ron Lyle. Folks, that was one of the most sloppy, entertaining heavyweight matchups of all time. Foreman was knocked down. Ron Lyle was eventually knocked out. Definitely a great fight. June of 1976, a TKO in the 5th round victory against the late Joe Frazier. Again, when you want to talk about guys having some guy's number, George Foreman has 2 knockouts against Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier gave Muhammad Ali some of his toughest battles. So it is always funny how styles make fights. Now, going back to the Rumble in the Jungle, George Foreman knocks out Joe Frazier in 2 rounds, the same Joe Frazier who beat Muhammad Ali. knocks out Ken Norton in 2 rounds. The same guy who beat Muhammad Ali and broke his jaw, by the way. And people even feel, fast forward, that Ken Norton beat Muhammad Ali in their trilogy. So that's why we stated going into that fight, the Rumble in the Jungle, Foreman had to be the favorite. Now let's go back to the Frazier fight. Foreman has 2 victories over Joe Frazier where we're not even getting past 6 rounds. But Joe Frazier could give Muhammad Ali his tough fights, but Ali beat Foreman. So that's the thing, how we always say styles make fights. I mean, that's just the beauty part of boxing. March of 1977, a unanimous decision victory against Jimmy Young. Feather-fisted Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico. That fight was significant because George Foreman did not have another professional boxing match for literally a decade. He retired from the sport, found religion, he became a born-again Christian, and you saw the difference when George came back. Now, you had Foreman of the 70s with the muscles and the fro, and now the older George Foreman coming back has now lost his hair. He's put on some weight. His physique was not as aesthetically pleasing as it was. So at the age of 38, George Foreman in March of 1987, a TKO victory in the 4th round against Steve Zuski. If anybody knows that name or that name sounds familiar, he fought Mike Tyson a year prior. And at this time, Mike Tyson is a heavyweight champion of the world, by the way. In March of 1988, a TKO in the 7th round against former cruiserweight champion Dwight Muhammad Cowie. Dwight Cowie fought a classic fight against Evander Holyfield, and only Holyfield's, I believe, 11, 12, or 13 fight. June of 1989, a referee stoppage against the late Burt Cooper. Burt Cooper once in 1991 gave Evander Holyfield a very tough fight. January of 1990, a KO in the 2nd round against Jerry Cooney. Jerry Cooney, who once challenged for the heavyweight championship of the world against Larry Holmes. And the big fight that really caught our attention, now this is like when we first started to become familiar with the sport, watching boxing. April 19th, 1991, a unanimous decision loss against then undisputed champion of the world, Evander the Real Deal Holyfield in Atlantic City. That was a very big fight, and I think that fight tends to get overlooked. Again, this is the era of Mike Tyson, all these other guys. So that fight tends to get overlooked, but that was a very exciting fight. It was funny. You saw Muhammad Ali was in the ring. George Foreman gave him a hug. So Foreman was challenging for the heavyweight championship of the world, put up a very valiant effort. But again, a younger, faster Evander Holyfield. Again, folks, George Foreman was 42 years old going into this fight, while Holyfield had just won a title not even a year prior. So definitely a great fight. Again, Atlantic City, we mentioned this before, how Atlantic City was the Las Vegas of boxing matches back then. In April of 1992, a majority decision against Alex Stewart. January of 1993, a TKO victory in the 8th round against trial horse Pierre Kutzer, a fighter out of South Africa. June of 1993, loses a unanimous decision against Tommy Morrison, the late Tommy Morrison, who was Tommy the Machine Gun in the Rocky V movie. November of 1994. Now, we have discussed this fight previously, of course, in our George Foreman fights, and that is ranked number 4 in our Chin Check Sports Radio top 10 upsets of all time. Now, watching this fight, Michael Moore had already beaten Evander Holyfield, and in the first 8-9 rounds, it was just bad. I mean, Michael Moore, the first Southpaw heavyweight champion of the world, just beating on him. I mean, Foreman looked like he had no business being in the ring with him. And again, George is 45 years old. So he's fighting Evander Holyfield at the age of 42 in April of 1991 and fighting in November of 1994 at the age of 45. And pretty much it was just a whitewash. Just beating on Foreman, quick hands, just beating on Foreman. So it was just easy. I mean, Foreman was just a heavy bag with feet. But then, folks, in that 10th round, when Foreman landed that right hand, and it landed square on the chin and the jaw of Michael Moore, and you saw the computers go out, the electricity go out, you saw Michael Moore land butt first, and his back hits that canvas, and his arms are spread across that mat. And the referee counts, and you see Michael Moore trying to get up. You see the blood, like a little bit of blood from the inside of his mouth. You see him roll over, he tries to get up, and he couldn't get up. And you see Foreman looking up at the heavens. And folks, we mentioned this before, we think one of the greatest calls in sports history, along with "Do you believe in miracles?" at the Al Michaels call. Chicago Bulls won the 6th NBA championship with Bob Costas. That call that Jim Lampley made by simply screaming, "It happened. It happened." One of the greatest calls ever in boxing history, one of the greatest calls of our lifetime in any sports. So let that sink in. Even now, when we go back and watch that fight, to hear what Jim Lampley's screaming, "It happened, it happened." And folks, the crowd is nuts. We were watching it, and we couldn't believe because it was one of those, he was getting beat from pillar to post, and all Michael Moore had to do was just stay on his feet or even get up. That's how far he literally won every round, and it was just surreal watching it. And George Foreman actually wore the same trunks that he wore when he fought Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. So you had that specter. So definitely one of the greatest upsets in boxing history. 45-year-old George Foreman winning the heavyweight championship of the world. And George really became a celebrity after that fight, which goes into the Foreman grills and had his own television show. So Foreman definitely became a big media star. So we're talking about those casual, and I know we mentioned guys who transcend the sport who never reach out to casual fans. Obviously, we've mentioned Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard and Mike Tyson and Oscar De La Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, Hagler. But definitely George Foreman definitely had a lot of mainstream appeal. He was seen as the jolly old heavyset guy, the jolly fat guy, run down the street eating cupcakes and cookies, versus the menacing George Foreman back in his younger days in the 70s. His first title defense, we have broken this down, April of 1995, a majority decision victory over Axel Schultz. We definitely broken that down. That's on our Chin Check Radio top 10 most controversial boxing decisions of all time. In November of 1996, a unanimous decision victory against Crawford Grimsley. In April of 1997, a split decision victory over Lou Savarese. In his final fight in November of 1997, a unanimous majority decision loss against Shannon Briggs. Yes, that's Shannon Let's Go Chant Briggs. Again, that fight is on the Chin Check Sports Radio top 10 controversial boxing decisions of all time. So, George Foreman, believe it or not, was still a commentator while being an active boxer. Let that sink in. Go back and watch the Riddick-Bowe fight. Again, we talked about some of these classic fights. The Riddick-Bowe fight from 1992, him and Evander Holyfield. George Foreman was called an action. By the way, I just gave you the dates at the fights that he fought afterwards. He called Evander Holyfield and Riddick-Bowe 3, where you clearly hear George going off on commentary about stopping the fight due to his general concern about Evander Holyfield and his health, and at that time with the whole heart issue. So George Foreman, as a heavyweight champion of the world, as an active fighter, was still an HBO commentator. So it was definitely surreal. In 1993, again, Riddick-Bowe in the rematch versus Evander Holyfield, the Fan Man incident, and he was an active fighter then. Let's go back to the Andrew Golota and Riddick-Bowe fight in Madison Square Garden, where all hell broke loose. Jim Lampley even states that, as hectic as the scene was, that George Foreman himself kept people away from Jim Lampley. He kept people away from Larry Merchant. He actually protected Jim Lampley. And even Jim Lampley was saying that I pin a badge of honor on you. So, and you even hear George, as the Riddick-Bowe people stormed the ring, he was telling them, "Don't do that, son. Don't do that." So George definitely was a calm in the storm in some of the most iconic and or infamous moments in boxing history. Now, of course, we have been critical of George Foreman's commentary style because we felt he was a little bit biased to certain fighters, and you clearly hear the biased commentary with guys like a Felix Trinidad or Oscar De La Hoya. But that's just what you got with George. But he was very passionate about it. Of course, him and Larry Merchant, they would have their on-air squabbles back and forth. Not necessarily taking shots at one another, but definitely Larry didn't agree with something. If George didn't agree with what Larry said, then George would speak up and vice versa. And Jim Lampley kind of always played the middleman. George Foreman's last broadcast, or one of his final broadcasts, we mentioned this before, was the Shane Mosley Oscar De La Hoya rematch. And we didn't agree with George's comments by saying that he felt promoters had something against Bob Arum. He kind of noticed that's when George kind of tailed off, and and he had a great retirement broadcast. So definitely George Foreman, again, as we stated this, played a huge part in why we do what we do at Chin Check Sports Radio, why we remember these fights vividly, why we love the sport of boxing. Again, the fighters themselves, Jim Lampley, George Foreman was a part of that. And thank you, George. You definitely made our childhood memories of boxing very fun. We definitely enjoyed your passion. We definitely enjoyed that Southern drawl. And from all appearance, you definitely came across as a great man. We respected the way how you parlayed your newfound success and fame of the 90s to the world famous George Foreman grills. Folks, we still cook and use George Foreman grills damn near every other day. So that's how popular these grills are. For any bachelor, single guy in college, the Foreman grill was one of the best inventions since caller ID. Simply put your food on the grill and close the grill. Now, there's been different variations of the Foreman grill. One of the first ones that we had separate timers on each side. So Foreman grills are great. So we are the biggest proponent of Foreman grills. Definitely loved the fact that George was able to put his name on the grill, and definitely took his newfound success and fame and parlayed that into an empire. So definitely to the family of George Foreman, once again, folks, you guys have our deepest sympathies. And the George Foreman champ, please rest in power. I know you're up there with the other great champions. You're up there with the late, great Muhammad Ali, the late, great Ken Norton, the late, great Joe Frazier. I'm sure you guys probably going to do a quick sparring session up there, or just sit down, at the round table and tell God about, the experiences of all fighting one another. So once again, George Foreman, rest in power, champ.